Hello, welcome to Conversations at Curzon. We are here today at Curzon Soho. I'm Hannah Strong, you are Brady Corbet.
Indeed I am.
The director / co-writer of The Brutalist, and we are here to talk about your movie, talk about the cinema, find out some of your favourite cinema memories, that kind of thing.
Fantastic.
I would love to start by asking you about your favourite cinemas. You're a world traveller, you've probably seen a lot of cinemas in your time, so I'm curious to find out where.
I mean, my first experience in the cinema was my hometown in Colorado. It was called the Springs Theater in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. I remember seeing a lot of popular films from the mid-1990s, like The Rock,
Oh, wow.
I believe I saw there.
Sean Connery film.
Exactly, Michael Bay.
Michael Bay.
Heat, I'm pretty sure I saw at that theater. I remember seeing The English Patient there.
And when you're at the cinema, do you have a sort of favourite spot that you like to sit in?
I just have to sit on the aisle.
Yeah.
It's just the same with airplanes. I mean, I'm
Really?
happy. Yeah, I'm happy to sit up front. I'm happy to sit in the back. I really don't care.
Just on the
but
aisle.
I have to be on the aisle.
Gotta have the escape
I
route.
I start to panic if I feel like I have to step over 17 strangers to get out.
Yeah, and if it's a bad movie, you don't want to have the awkward thing of like, sorry.
That's why I have an intermission. You know, give everyone the option to leave.
I mean, as someone who loves going to the theatre, I was very grateful for the intermission, and that is a good kind of place to pick up because I was curious to know if you got any resistance about putting an intermission in the middle of your film.
Oh, yes, there was plenty of resistance. I mean, listen, I think that there are certain choices that filmmakers make. For example, if you're shooting your movie in black and white, its international value goes down by quite a lot. So you're forced to make your film for a lot less money. A long film, of course, is high up on that list, and a long film with an intermission is very high up on that list. But you just have to try to get on with it. And part of our sort of pitch with the intermission was, well, it's a rolling intermission. So, there'll be a timer on screen and people will know how much time they have to leave. So, if a cinema doesn't even, feel like bothering to turn the lights on or whatever, they don't really have to think about it. And if they want to make an event out of the experience, then they can, and hopefully they can, sell some more concessions, etc.
I mean, I've seen nothing but glowing feedback on the kind of social media side of things. People are very into it having an intermission.
Yeah, but I think audiences, especially post-COVID, where we all were very concerned that we might never get to have that experience again or have it in the same way, I think that's part of the reason people are having this response, because it's certainly not the first movie to have an intermission. It's not even the first contemporary movie to have an intermission. So I think that it's just that, following what we all went through, and we were so scared for our local cinemas, and we thought, are we doomed to watch everything on our couch for the rest of our life? And for cinephiles, that's kind of as bad as it gets. I mean, it's a real curse.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think the kind of third space of the cinema, you do pay your £20 or however much it is now, but being able to see people, see friends, meet people, and having an intermission is great because you get to talk about the movie.
Exactly. It creates a conversation and you check in with everyone. I totally agree. I really miss them, and some people were telling me, this film is like barely long enough to justify having one because it's only 100 minutes, in part one and 100 minutes in part two. But for me personally, I find it so frustrating to spend, the last 45 minutes of a movie thinking I really need to run to the restroom. And so I want people to be focused on the film. I don't want them to be uncomfortable.
Especially considering now there's such a thing with checking your phone or just kind of being distracted at cinema. If you're giving people, hey, here's 15 minutes, do what you got to do, come back.
Well, I'm also trying to find the silver lining of the streaming era.
Yeah.
And that was something that I was saying a lot to financiers was, I was like, people are accustomed to binge watching, 5 or 6 hours of whatever, they're into nowadays. And so I was like, well, why doesn't it work for this format as well? And eventually this film, of course, will live on streaming platforms. And I was like, you can do whatever you want with it. You can do a volume 1, a volume 2, A, B side, I don't care. But I wanted for the theatrical experience to really preserve, this. And so far, so good. I mean, I'm happy that people are into it.
Yeah, and I mean, particularly with the Brutalist, because you've been working on it for such a long time, there must be that kind of, particular emotional attachment to kind of, this is my baby, this is something that's been with me since before COVID.
Well, it's interesting because that's how you feel during the entire process. You feel like you are protecting this flame from burning out for many years. And, there are a lot of obstacles in one's path. But when I finish a movie, I stop feeling so protective of it. It's an interesting thing. I'm not as controlling about materials like posters, teasers, trailers, etc., as one might think, because the thing is that, there's nothing I can do about American Airlines doing an airplane edit of my film. I can't go into people's living rooms and calibrate their televisions for them. So at a certain point, you have to give your movie away. And so, and it becomes a piece of public art. With all of the initial screenings on 70 millimeter, just because it's such an art form to project it, and we did have a lot of early screenings that were pretty out of focus for a variety of different reasons. So in the very beginning, I did kind of pop around and give as many folks as I could pointers about where to find the focus, because celluloid in general, it's much softer. It's a lot darker. The luminance is it's 40% or something of what the luminance of a digital picture is. So it is actually hard sometimes to know exactly where the focus falls. So I ran around for a little while giving people, I was like, if you cannot read Philadelphia Express on the back of that bus, then the movie is out of focus.
That's a good thing to have. Here's this one shot that
exactly.
You can, I remember seeing the pictures from, I think it was Mulholland Drive. David Lynch had kind of sent around okay, this is how you set the sound for this movie. And I think it speaks to not only the great care that someone like David Lynch had for his movies, but also the fact that this is an art form that's dying out. Projectionists now are so few and far between, and there are so kind of more and more films being made on film every year. And it's like, well, we need to kind of train people, meet demand. And
something I think that's very important is for us to really document that process in a very meticulous fashion. For example, many years ago, when Kodak's lab shut down in New York City, Edward Lachman took all of that equipment and at his own expense, he stored it for years. And then when Kodak finally was able to start up their lab again, Ed had all that equipment ready for them, and
what a legend!
He's such a legend. I mean, he's given so much to the medium. Not only is he one of the greatest cinematographers of all time, but he just loves the medium so much. But I think that, and I've had this conversation with Ed a lot, where it's like we have to keep the tradition alive. Otherwise, people are gonna forget how to do it, and it's a very complicated analog process.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a good way to talk about VistaVision, because
Absolutely.
It's a process that was at once the kind of pinnacle of what the medium was capable of doing, and then really very quickly fell out of favor as technology does advance so quickly.
Of course.
So for you, what was the kind of discovery process of thinking, hang on, we should be using this, and how tricky was it then to kind of resurrect it?
We expected the format to be a lot more difficult to work with than it was. So I'm happy to report that even though we did have a dedicated VistaVision technician on set with us at all times in case it were to break down, the camera was very well serviced, and it was a lot less finicky than we expected it to be. We decided to shoot the film on the format because it was a camera that was engineered in the 1950s, and the film is predominantly set in the 1950s. So we just sort of thought that it was the best format to transport viewers to the period. And people had been using it. It was even used for a handful of shots. Robbie used it on Poor Things for visual effect shots. It's just that it was unusual for people to use it for the narrative parts of their movies, and so there were enough folks kicking the tires on it that we were able to make a few phone calls, and my cinematographer Lil Crawley had actually been a loader on Star Wars The Phantom Menace, where they were using VistaVision for their visual effect shots. So he had actually interfaced with the camera many years earlier. And I just think that it's an incredibly beautiful format. And, we shot the film on a variety of different formats. We shot the film also on regular 3x35, 16 millimeter digibeta, depending on the circumstances, even though it is predominantly VistaVision. But one thing that's interesting about VistaVision is that because it's so high fidelity, if something looks bad, which is to say it's flatly lit, or you're in a location or something that is just not particularly attractive, it makes bad things worse because it's so high fidelity and there's so much information that it weirdly can start to look a little bit like bad television. So if there was an environment, like if we were shooting at noon and everyone was just getting blasted with sunlight, it was never the tool that I reached for. But anything which was gorgeous was infinitely more gorgeous on this format. So I always try to make it very clear that it's not about celluloid versus digital, because there are, many of my favorite films were shot digitally. Dogma 95, of course, but then, John's films, The Zone of Interest from last year. There are films that, can and should only exist on that format. My concern is that if not enough filmmakers are carrying the torch for celluloid, that it will die out, because we used to have Kodak and Fuji, and now we only have Kodak. So there's only one game in town, and for me, I just have always described it as the difference between a watercolor and painting with oil. And can you imagine going to the National Gallery and there's no oil paintings on view? I think that's a really upsetting proposition.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think it's a strange situation we're in now as a cinema kind of culture, where it's seen as like this kind of, purist bro thing to be like, oh, we should preserve film and, kind of keep it alive. But it's almost like, well, you just want to have as many options as possible when you're making a movie, right?
Exactly.
And, you want to be able to use the tool that fits the job, like VistaVision.
Well, absolutely. And also, for example, there are digital cameras that, can do things in very, very, very low light, where it sees more than the human eye can see. And that's like a great example of, how and when to reach for that tool. But I think there's a strange stigma attached to shooting celluloid, where it's regarded by a lot of people as a privilege, as like a status thing. And just to be very clear, I mean, my first film was made for $3 million, and it was shot on 35 millimeter. My second film had a production budget of roughly $4.5 million. And this film was shot on a large format and was made for $10 million. So if I can do it, most filmmakers can do it. And And I mean, I even know filmmakers that prioritize the format that are making movies that are sub $1 million. Now you have to make sacrifices and move sand around in the box accordingly to make it happen. But I just sort of want to dispel that myth a little bit, because that it's so ungodly expensive, because it is not for free to shoot something digitally. And there's this strange thing when you're having a conversation with a line producer where I'm like, how many terabytes is this, hard drive? Like, all of these things have costs that are associated with them. Making movies is an expensive, it's an expensive medium. I mean, as is building a building.
The two things that you and Lazo Toth have in common.
Sure. Unfortunately, we probably have more than that in common.
Well, that's a good place to start talking about Adrien Brody, I think, because
Sure.
he is so much like has been splashed all over the posters. He is monumental in the film, not just because he's very tall, but because the presence he has on screen is so important to the success of The Brutalist. And I'm curious to know if he was someone that you had in your head all those years ago when you started working on the film, or if that came later.
Well, he was one of the first people that we ever spoke about, of course, because he was, because of his background. His family
Absolutely.
is Hungarian. They fled Hungary during the revolution, 1956, and he was the right age. And, when you are putting together a short list of, for everyone in the ensemble, it's you're checking avails and seeing who can jump in for this iteration of the project, that iteration of the project. It took a little while for our schedules to align, because we met in 2019 about it, and then finally, I believe that Adrien came on a year later in 2020, and then or maybe it was early 2021, and then we were shooting in the first quarter of 2022. So he was certainly one of the first people that we ever spoke about. But, when he and I sat down and spoke about the project, he was so soulful, and I was sort of struck by, I was like, this character on the page is not written to be likable, but the character is flawed, and for philosophical reasons, this character is flawed, because something that I really struggle with in a lot of survivor stories is that they are these altruistic angels, which for me suggests that the only way that an audience can empathize with them is if they're perfect. And yet none of us are perfect, and we should be able to empathize with someone who's been through something so horrific, even if they are poorly behaved occasionally. But with Adrien, he just had this sort of grace note that was not on the page, and I knew that it would bring something to the material that I never could have really anticipated, which was the number one reason that I was, felt like, okay, this is our guy. And I think that he's a performer like Gregory Peck. Like, he feels like an actor of another era, and that's sort of what I think Guy Pearce and Felicity and Joe Alwyn, who, like, if you close your eyes and listen to Joe Alwyn, like, he sounds exactly like Joseph Cotten. It's like crazy. The entire cast of this film, I think it was sort of self-selecting, because the material was so challenging and the monologues were so long and stuff that I think people, they felt like they wanted to do it if they knew that they could do it. and a lot of, I think performers felt sort of intimidated by it, frankly. So, I mean, for example, Alessandra Nivola has a really difficult task in the film, which is to play a character that has assimilated over the course of about 20 to 25 years. And there's still a hint of his Hungarian accent, which he is intentionally trying to repress. And that's sort of as difficult a task, for example, as Julianne Moore doing like good bad acting in Boogie Nights.
Yeah.
Like it's very difficult for a great actor to play a bad actor. And and so it's really just this special, you know, thing that only a few people really have the chutzpah to take on. And I, you know, I really commend the entire cast for that, because there was, you had to commit. Like they're big swings, and like, you know, you really, if you were waffling in the middle, like you'd just be left behind.
You've worked with some incredible directors yourself in the past. I'm curious to know kind of how your experience of being a young actor informed the way you work as a director.
I think that, well, I mean, there's two things on this. I mean, one is that I started when I was so young. I was 7 years old when I was on my first film set. So for me, there was never really a before. There was only an after. So I don't really have anything to compare it to. But one thing I will say is that because there were many filmmakers I worked with that I admired so much before, during, and after the process of making a movie with them, it was demystifying for me in a very important and positive way that even, you know, the most formally rigorous of those filmmakers, they had bad days, and they were human beings, and you know, it's something. It was a good reminder, I would say, for me, that I don't have to be perfect. You know, it's a very challenging job. You're herding a lot of cats. You're spinning a lot of plates, and you have some days which are very successful, and you have days that are less successful, and you just have to, you know, kind of keep going. And so I think that my experience working with those filmmakers, it gave me the courage to continue. Whereas, you know, if I hadn't had that experience, maybe I'd think it was like, oh, it's just me that faces these sorts of struggles. When in fact, you know, even the biggest filmmakers on the planet, they still have their movies get postponed and fall apart, and it's something that just happens forever. That's part of the game, unfortunately.
And someone like Greg Araki, I mean, how many years since he's got to make a movie, and now finally we're getting a new one. But it's, you know, that thing, if you can be a genius, your films can be critically heralded, audiences can love you, but that doesn't necessarily equate to getting to make a film every 3 years.
Well, especially because the film industry has changed so much since the 1990s. The 1990s was an extraordinary time for cinema, and I think we are really starting to get that now, that, you know, like, that there was an embarrassment of riches. Like,
oh, absolutely.
Like tentpole release films, they were original. They were not based on some nonsense source material. Like, they were really great movies that were made with real craft and artistry, and they were three-dimensional. You know, everything was not shot against a green screen. Like, if like a car was driving off a bridge, it was driving off a bridge. And so I think that, you know, I one thing on a positive note that I'll say about all of the films that are in the conversation this year is that I think it's really signaling something for the powers that be, that, you know, whether people love or hate the films that are, you know, part of the awards conversation this year, they're very radical movies. Like, they're strange movies, they're experimental movies. I mean, even, you know, Denis, Dune 2 is a very experimental, radical film. And so, you know, that's really heartening for me, because I feel like it really goes against the algorithm.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, it can't be a fluke anymore. Like, when Oppenheimer made $1 billion at the box office, you know, of course, that's a Christopher Nolan movie, but it's not an action movie. It's a historical drama.
It's a 3-hour drama.
And it's 3 hours long. And like, a third of it's in black and white, and you know, it's mostly adults having conversations. I mean, that's what the movie is.
Yeah.
And so the fact that that made $1 billion at the box office, you know, I think that that really means something. And I think Hollywood is always trying to evaluate, like, was this a fluke? Was this an accident? When in fact, I think audiences are telling us, we will come, you know, we'll get off our couch and we will come out to the cinema if you make it worth our while.
It's Kevin Costner all over again. It's if you build it, they will come.
Yeah, I agree. No, I really agree.
No, I think you're completely correct. And I think as well, seeing something like Dune 2, which is a $200 million movie, and something like The Brutalist, which is a $10 million movie, in the same awards conversation, that's like a huge plus for cinema. It proves that you can do things on a budget, you can do things on a higher scale, and
Absolutely.
they can be completely brilliant in their own right.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing that's notable about, you know, Denis' $200 million movie is that, you know, his $200 million is very well spent. It looks like he spent $200 million on the movie. I see a lot of $200 million movies where I'm like,
where did that go? Was that catering?
It's sort of befuddling.
And I think as well that comes from the fact that he is a filmmaker who got his start making money, making no budget movies, basically.
Absolutely.
You know?
I mean,
he knows how to be nimble.
Maelstrom and Incendie, and I mean, you know, I actually just wrote Denis wrote me a really sweet message the other day, and I replied to him and said, you know, I was like, you know, I've never told you this, but your short film, Next Floor, is one of my favorite short films I've ever seen. It's like, it rivals, you know, Janae and Caro. Like, it's so brilliant. And I was like, it was a massively influential film for me. So
that collegiateness is really lovely to hear about as well. You know, you've mentioned a few filmmakers throughout this conversation and cinematographers, and it's just so lovely to hear about the professional respect that people have for each other, you know?
For the most part, it's a pretty supportive industry because it's a very difficult industry.
Yeah.
And people, you know, people really do care about the ecosystem and paying it forward. You know, in my case, I'm 36 years old, so I've got, you know, the generation that's come just before me, you know, like reaching out to say, let me know how I can be supportive. And I'm, of course, in turn, trying to do the same thing with, you know, filmmakers that haven't even made their first movie yet. And I think that that is very, very important because someone gave me my first chance. And so, you know, when young people talk, I listen.
Yeah, and as fun as the Oscars are, that's what it has to be. That's what this all is about, you know? It's not about the dresses and the awards, it's about paying it forward.
No, 100%. And it's about sort of creating a sustainable, you know, business because, you know, as a filmmaker, you're freelance for life. And these sorts of accolades just make it a little bit, you know, more viable for you to continue doing what you're doing. And that's kind of all that matters because, you know, we most of us, we forget. I mean, I forget 1 or 2 years later who was nominated for what. But it's so important for the film right now.
Yeah.
And it's exciting that for a film that's as radical as this one, that it's given it such a boost commercially. And that's a good thing for cinema.
Well, thank you so much for joining me at Curzon today to talk about The Brutalist.
Thank you.
I'm thrilled that the movie has done as well as it has, and I hope that it has an even longer life on streaming.
Well, I really appreciate it. I appreciate it. Curzon has first dibs.